Hello, everybody. We are back to talk about some more television on our Writer's Block channel. We have a couple of us here today, not the full squad, but a good number of opinions about Andor. So, with Andor having just wrapped up, what are you fellas thinking? Was it a satisfying series to watch? What do you think?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
I have never been the biggest fan of Star Wars as a whole franchise, mostly because I was disillusioned to the Joseph Campbell archetypal hero story very early on. Like first learned about it in high school, and by the time I got to college, I was mostly over it. So really, the only Star Wars things that I have liked before Andor came out were The Last Jedi and The Mandalorian. And at that point, I was kind of jaded to the idea that there would be anything else that they could bring out with increasingly obscure characters that I would actually care about. And then you guys finally convinced me to watch it, and I'm so glad you did because it has beaten out Mandalorian on my list of favorite Star Wars things because it's just that good.
There is nothing that beats good writing for television. Uh, Even good writing for films just can't quite touch it because you just don't have the amount of time to sit with things and develop things and get the little nuances. Not to say that there's not great film writing, because there is, but for my money, I would rather watch a well-written TV show than just about anything else. And Andor is probably the best written TV I've seen in a good long while.
There's a reason that people talk a lot more about binging entire seasons of TV shows versus binging like movie trilogies and such. Like with show writing versus movie screenplay writing, there's just the logistics of at what point is this audience going to be exhausted enough that we have to get things moving if it's a movie where you're expecting them to sit through something that's like 1.5 to 2.5 hours. But with Andor specifically, and just television shows in general, you can do the great thing of letting things be on a slow boil and not needing a lightsaber fight every 5 minutes in order to keep the kiddies engaged. You can examine more like adult ideas and adult stories in television because it's a format that is far more flexible in how you can tell your stories in the first place, in my opinion, at least.
Andor, particularly the parts of it from Cassian's perspective, is a story about the slow but steady radicalization of a man who does not want to be involved, right? And that slow and steady pace specifically cannot function elsewhere, right? Really remarkable show. Remarkable show. I'm not from the same background as Jonah. I grew up loving Star Wars, and I still like quite a bit of Star Wars. I don't think that it is the like prestigious, well-written saga that some fans treat it as though it is. And my thoughts about the sequels, I think, are fairly different from a fair number of people's thoughts about the sequels. In that I also liked The Last Jedi because I was like, hey, we're trying something. That's a novel concept in Star Wars. This, I think, this is way up there on my list of Star Wars media. This did something for me that no other Star Wars TV show has done, and very few Star Wars few Star Wars movies has done either. Really, just remarkable.
I was impressed that they being sort of the Disney overlords, the folks running the show at this point, were willing to step back a little bit and back off some of the um, like Jonah was saying, some of the need for a lightsaber battle or an action set piece at predetermined points in, you have to have one at minute 20 in episode 2 and minute 40 at here, um for us to be able to let it breathe a little bit more. I was shocked watching the first 2 episodes of the show because so little happened. That's the wrong way to say that. Plenty happened, but it was slow, it was measured, it was quiet for the most part. And you'd get to the end of the episode and be like, oh wait, that was the end of an episode. I was waiting for a punch and I didn't necessarily get one. Especially the first 2 episodes I felt like were that way, where you're sort of waiting for the story to take off, but then it does, and boy does it take off. Nevertheless, I really appreciate a story that is willing to take its time and and lay the groundwork so that when you do hit those high moments, you feel them, right? You're invested in the characters, you're invested in the location and in the plot line, rather than, oh, we need to have a fight now, which was what so much of Boba Fett especially was, where you're just like, okay, now we've got a Vespa chase through the city, and that's stupid. And this just didn't need that, and so it didn't have it. It was great.
Yeah. I think that's a good way of putting it, right? Like Andor is a TV show that knows what it needs, and it does nothing else, right? Like I'm not recalling any moment in this show where I thought to myself, this does not contribute to the central plot line, to the character arcs, and to the overall themes of this TV show. Everything felt really purposeful to me.
I think honestly, for me, Andor is just as much about what they don't do as versus what they do. I'm not going to be able to shut up about archetypal characters when talking about Star Wars, because how deeply Lucas ingrained the original trilogy with Campbell's archetypes. I might have to do a separate video by myself on it or something. But the fact is that Cassian Andor is the titular character, and he's not even on my top 3 favorite characters in this show, because more than even the Mandalorian, the people in Andor feel like people instead of cardboard cutouts. And not even just in the sense that they're characters with motivations, it's that not a single one of them adheres to the idea of the Empire or the Rebellion as we know it from the movies. Like, prequel trilogy was very much the Rebellion is good because they're good, and the Empire is bad because they're bad. And yet in Andor, we have my favorite character, Dedra Miro, who works for the Empire. And yet I root for her in every single scene that she is in. And so many times I asked my roommate who I was watching this with, why are we rooting for her? Why do I care about her succeeding when she's literally being a fascist? And it's because they present these characters, they present Luthen, they present Mon Mothma in these situations where either we root for them when we don't want to, or we have to step back and go, are we sure that this person is right? Luthen's monologue in episode 10 is finally where the show goes, yes, here's why you care about this man who is ruthlessly letting a colleague and a squadron of his rebels die to save one mole. And it's just that's the climax of the show for me, honestly, is just the writers and the characters willing to go, we understand what we're doing, and it's more about just blowing up a Death Star. It's about being something, even if we're all infighting while doing it.
To that point, for me, I think the theme of this TV show may be sacrifice. The question of what are authoritarians willing to sacrifice to stay in power? Which the show progressively gives the answer, absolutely anything, right? Law, human rights, eventually with the case of the Death Star, right? Entire planets will be sacrificed for authoritarian rule, right? But also in the case of Cassian, how much are you willing to sacrifice to not be involved, right? Like when have they taken too much for you to say, I can still walk away from this, right? In the case of Dedra Miro, in the pursuit of authoritarian power, in the pursuit of climbing the ladder, in the pursuit of imperial law, she continues to sacrifice protocol. She continues to sacrifice potential relationships with colleagues. She is ready to sacrifice absolutely anything and everything, right? And while I don't think that I connected with her on the same level that Jonah did, she's an extremely compelling character, because there is, every time that that moment comes up, I ask myself, is this when the sacrifice is too much? And so far in season 1, and based on the type of character that she is, I think it's going to be the same way in season 2. There is no point at which she will not, right? Yeah.
The show's willingness to play in shades of gray is so fascinating, because you do have these empire aligned folks who are at the very least fascinating, if not love worthy or whatever. But then on the other side, you've got Luthen, especially, as sort of the mastermind for the rebellion, who is playing from the bad guy's playbook. Now, these are not necessarily my original thoughts. I'm cribbing heavily from an article that I read on Polygon, I want to say, a few days ago, where it talked about the idea that the show consciously is pulling in Sith iconography for Luthen, because he is truly dedicated to the cause, to the point where he is willing to sacrifice people and do bad things to good people for the greater good. And I don't think you've ever seen in Star Wars somebody who is willing to be the bad guy for a good end. It's so morally gray that it's super, super compelling. And I agree, the highlight of the show is his monologue at the end of episode 10, where he sort of lays the themes bare, where he says, I have sacrificed my own humanity in order for this to succeed, and if that's what it takes, then I'll do it again.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. And that on the heels of Cassian escaping from the prison, which was a great sequence. I mean, really, that's the climax of the season. And episodes 11 and 12 are just sort of the bricks falling over the dominoes toppling that came from that episode, to where you get to an inevitable conclusion that is quite satisfying, but nowhere near as thrilling or action packed as what came before. It's really pretty fascinating.
Yeah, yeah, to that point, right? Like, everything that happens after One Way Out is denouement, because the crux of this TV show is not the events, but it's Cassian eventually accepting that when you are faced with evil in its most bureaucratic and systematic sense, there is one way out, right? And once he recognizes that, once he realizes that, other people are also coming to that conclusion in the same episode, and everything else is just falling action, right? Like, we've reached the climactic moment. And it's just falling away from that. And I think it's beautiful that in that episode, we see Luthen, and also my land, I am forgetting his name, Andy Serkis's character. We see the both of them. My gosh, I almost just, last name is Loy. Whatever the case, both of them make tremendous sacrifices, right? Like, Luthen is making his sacrifice of just him as an individual, right? Any hope, any dreams, anything, right? That's big. But then at the same time, Kilo Loy, there we go. Kilo Loy sacrifices his life, right? Like, he pushes people into this insurrection, into this revolutionary moment, even as he knows the whole time that he can't swim, right? That he is leading people to a safety and to an escape that he will never see. Both of them, right? Both of them share their dreams with ghosts, with Kilo in that episode becoming a ghost that Luthen shares his dream with, right? Like, it's just, I very nearly cried right now just saying that. It's so emotional, guys. It's the most powerful. Yeah, I wept watching this TV show a few times. It's beautiful.
It's kind of amazing how most of the, like, quote unquote thesis statements for the show are given by Luthen or in some way portrayed by the rebel characters, because there's Luthen's monologue, obviously. There's my other favorite one where he points a gun at Saw Gerrera and goes, "This is the only way you will understand." But it's also just fascinating seeing what exactly is sacrifice that matters to people, because Luthen's obviously at the top of the sacrifice totem pole doing anything he can. And yet Saw Gerrera, despite having so little screen time, gives a very good representation of what he's sacrificing, because he gives that whole rant about this laundry list of different rebel factions and how he hates what they stand for because they're separatists or partitionists or whatever. And so we see that by agreeing to work with Luthen and being willing to work with these other rebel factions, he's sacrificing his own ideals. He acknowledges that defeating the enemy at any cost is better than fighting for what only a few people believe in. And then my third favorite character, Mon Mothma, I had no idea who she was before this show. I knew her because Genevieve O'Reilly plays her, and I love Genevieve O'Reilly. But all I knew of Mon Mothma was the white-dressed, red-haired woman in Return of the Jedi and in Rogue One, who has like 5 minutes of screen time. And so being introduced to her in this season, seeing she's a wealthy senator on Coruscant, I'm like, oh, I know where she ends up. I know what she has given up to let this happen. And it emphasizes over and over again what is really necessary to get to the point where Luke can make a force shot at the Death Star itself. It just gives so much context for the archetypal story that we got in the prequels, that that's what's really meaningful for me, is giving the context behind just the cardboard cutout.
The show is just so tightly constructed. It is so difficult to take a group of characters that you know where they're going to end up already. You've seen them at their endpoints. It's true for Cassian. It's true for Mon Mothma, Saw Gerrera to a lesser extent, and show how they got there and still have that be interesting. I mean, most of what we watch for is the story, right? How does this end? Where do these folks go? And when you already know that, you lose a lot of the compelling thrust of storytelling. And the fact that they have managed to make this as compelling as they have is, again, testament to a really tight writer's room.
Yeah. Just ever so briefly, if I may, to the point of Jonah talking about Mon Mothma, I do want to say that there is, and to the point of what you're talking about, Cameron, I think there's also a meta commentary on sacrifice, right? Because out of all these characters, who do we see in the original trilogy, right? We see one of all of these, right? Like, so we know what's going to happen to them. We know where they end up, right? Like, by and large, at the very least. The assumption is that the vast majority, if not all of these characters, will die. And like the willingness to do so, right? Like even the prologue nature of it drives home sacrifice, right? It's so good. It's so good.
So I think we can safely say we all liked the show.
Yeah.
Do we have anything negative to say? I mean,
well, I was just going to say it's interesting that this show and House of Dragons are both doing that same sort of thing, where you know where the characters end up, but succeeding in telling that sort of story. So, if anyone wants to look at how to do a successful prequel, I mean, I think these are certainly what you could look at. But yeah, I mean, it seems like the agreement here is that definitely worth the watch, definitely enjoyable, and for a myriad of different Star Wars fans. Because unless I'm wrong, Cameron, obviously you're a fan of the original trilogy. Mason, I remember you saying you were a fan of the trilogy after that because you sort of saw it more initially as a kid, enjoyed it, right? And then some of the recent stuff, and then Jonah, as you were saying, more just the recent stuff, right? So yet for all three of you, even though you came from sort of different Star Wars, places, if you will, all of you are thoroughly enjoying the show. And it seems to be because of the nuance and the gray and getting to see, different sides you wouldn't normally expect. As we close up, though, just as you were pointing out, Cameron, are there any negatives about the show?
This isn't a negative of mine, but it is the most commonly leveled critique that I've heard of the show, which is it does take a few episodes to ramp up, right? Which I would say is kind of the nature of this beast. But if what you're looking for is a fast-paced punch 'em up, uh, funny, just joyride, you're looking in the wrong place, right? Like this isn't that. Go find it somewhere else.
My family, for instance, will never want to watch this show because there's just no humor to it. It's all so subtle and so small that they would feel really cheated because they really feel the need for the contrast between comedy and drama. And this hits the drama line pretty hard most of the way through. So yeah, maybe it's not for everybody, but boy, for my buck, this is where it's at.
The one character for me that didn't land as much as he probably could have was Cyril Karn. Like he's still very well written in the kind of character he's supposed to be, but specifically the jump from overly stiff protocol following, but still a sense of justice, fascist cog, to the very incel like kind of chasing after dead Ramiro for a reason I didn't entirely understand. That felt kind of abrupt. It didn't feel like they botched it, but in a world of perfectly executed pirouettes, this just felt kind of like a jump in the air. I don't know if that metaphor landed either, but
I do agree with that. That jump could have been better connected, though I did really love the twisted relationship with his mother and some of the great
his
back and
mother
forth.
is what holds that together, honestly,
Yeah.
because she shows why he's the way he is.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. I know we're low on time. I will just say one criticism that I have heard people of color bring up, which I do think is really valid, is Marva taking Cassian, right? Like there is no opportunity for Cassian to opt in, right? Like not only that, but they drug the child to take him away, right, which is something that we see at the beginning of the show that he still hasn't reconciled with, right? That's a pretty real world thing. There are plenty of children taken away from cultures and things like that that are deemed a disaster, and in this case we kind of lampshade it, and say everyone there died, and just kind of brush that along. But there is complexity and some very legitimate criticisms of that action and similar ones in the real world.
Well, on that note, overall, seems like 3 thumbs up, generally speaking, or 6 if
Yeah, if
everybody's using 2, everybody's using 2 around the world there. We hope this has given either some insight into why you might want to watch Andor if you have not yet, perhaps made you curious, perhaps you heard some storytelling elements you would like to see, or an opportunity to think about why you did like the show, what your thoughts are about this, and of course, as always, we would love to hear. Thanks for joining us, everyone, today on the Writer's Block talking about Andor. We will see you next time, Blackheads.